Howdy, I'm Jammer. So, here we are, yet again. And, what was I going to say? Damn, I've already goofed. Oh well, I remember what I was going to say. Only took, like 15 seconds. Wow, that was fast. Anyway, hi, welcome again to the channel. Clearly, I'm a goof. Somehow or another, I still find women who are interested in me. Shocker, I know. But we talk a lot about comics on this channel, obviously. And we've talked about a lot of books already, but one of the things I've also tried to bring attention to is the fact that sometimes one of the interesting things about comics is there are noted creators that sort of gain a reputation because they manage to just do something with the medium of comics. Now, when you're talking about big names in comics, you automatically probably think of Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Grant Morrison, my boy, Neil Gaiman, Dave McKean, Jeff Johns is a really big one. Amanda Conner is a really interesting artist who originally started in Archie Comics and then eventually made the transfer over to DC, where she's done stuff like Harley Quinn and Starfire, what have you. Those are superhero comics. And again, there are some people who reduce superhero comics simply because they're popular. I don't. There's a lot of amazing, great superhero comics out there. I'm going to keep talking about them on this channel. But as much as we talk about superhero comics being like the predominantly mainstream form of comics, there's also another series of big names that probably don't come to mind as much. These are names like Alison Bechdel. You might have heard of her. She wrote the graphic novel Fun Home, which was eventually transferred into a musical. And you know that because every, white girl in her 20s loves singing Ring of Keys as if they know what it's like to be queer. Hashtag throwing shade. But alongside Alison Bechdel, there's also some other names you might have heard of. Names like Robert Crumb. We're going to get to him at some point. But then there's one name that's really big, and if the graphic novel Besides Me isn't proof enough, it's Art Spiegelman. Now I know immediately what you're going to do. You're going to sit up in your chair and go, "Are we doing Mouse?" To which I go, no. At least, not yet. Right in front of me is my to-read shelf. It's 3 shelves high, and it's completely packed full of books. And it doesn't help that I keep buying new books and checking out books from my library. On top of that, I also have a full-time job, and I'm trying to make comics, which tends to eat up a lot of my time. And so, I promise, we're going to get to Mouse, because you can't talk about comics without talking about Mouse. But I thought it would be interesting to tackle a different book, because as much as Mouse has sort of become the hallmark of the, legitimization of comics as a medium in terms of the public eye, and Spiegelman is very much to thank for that, it's easy to forget that Spiegelman started off in the underground comics scene. Now, if you don't know what underground comics is, that's a series of videos unto itself, which I should honestly think about doing that in the future. Just go to the Wikipedia page for underground comics. Recommend using the X instead of CS. That's its own thing. I'm not going to get into it here. But the underground comics scene, particularly in New York and Los Angeles, and especially during the 1960s and early 70s, was really important because it established a group of artists that really impacted the medium of comics. It's really difficult today when you have companies like First Second who put out amazing, wonderful books all the damn time in these big, beautiful, hardbound editions, and it's easy to remember or think to yourself, wow, comics they're just a wonderful medium. You can do all sorts of stories with them. That's still relatively new. That concept is still only a couple of decades old. Again, as I'm fond of pointing out, most of people's experience with comics tends to be superhero comics or newspaper comic strips. Now, it's changing. Again, Mouse is Mouse. This is a book which is taught in public schools as well as certain college classrooms, and it's won a Pulitzer Prize. So the medium of comics, it's easy to say that this book helped legitimize comics as a medium. There are probably dozens of other books that did it, but it's true. Art Spiegelman really played an important role with this book in sort of doing something new with comics that a lot of people really hadn't experienced before. But what's also really important is the underground independent comic scene is where Art Spiegelman got his start and really where he established his craft. And it's particularly in this collection, which is actually the focus of today's video, Breakdowns, Portrait of the Artist as a Last, and I suspect he probably said Portrait of the Artist as a young shit or as a young fucker. I don't know. It's Portrait of the Artist as a young censored. But this book here, this very, very large book here, though it's actually deceptively large, is actually pretty skinny. But this book here is actually a really important book when we talk about the development of the underground comic scene, the development of the independent comic scene, and then ultimately the development of Art Spiegelman as an artist who helped really establish comics in the public eye as a medium that had not just a potential for storytellers, but also the possibility to, again, express humanity in the most purest form and in a way that most people had not experienced before. I will praise Mouse to the end of time. This is too good and too important a book to ignore. And I'm not saying we should ignore it. But what I'm also saying, is that we should also note that Art Spiegelman didn't just pop out Mouse. Breakdowns really shows Art Spiegelman developing his craft as an author. And so today, I'd really like to kind of just dig into this book and hopefully explain why, if you like comics, and if you like reading comics, and if you appreciate the medium of comics, Breakdowns is too important not to read. So, let's get into what exactly Breakdown is actually about. I would like to just kind of hold it up like this because, dear Lord, this book is really, really big. Now, what exactly Breakdown's Portrait of the Artist as a young censored, what is it about? It's not really about anything. What Breakdowns essentially is it's a collection of independent stories. The way you might see, say, and of course I didn't provide an immediate one, the way, say, an author of prose may put out a collection of short stories, Breakdowns essentially is a collection of short stories, but in comics. Again, Art Spiegelman really got his start in the underground comic scene, particularly in the New York region. And one of the earliest places he published his work was in a book titled Raw. Now, this isn't an original. God, I wish I owned an original, but if you could find an original, those copies can get upwards of hundreds of, if not thousands of dollars. A lot of the underground comics back in the day published maybe 500, maybe even sometimes just 50 copies of issues, number 1 or 2 or 3, what have you. And so if you still manage to have one, you can make a lot of money. Or you can be a super rich collector and just buy them all up. I did the route of, I went to Amazon, I found a recently republished copy of Raw, I bought it because I wanted to see what kind of magazine this was. Raw was extraordinarily important for a whole host of comic artists on the scene in New York and, again, in the sort of northeastern United States to really just sort of create a space where you could publish weird, aka not superhero comics. These were comics that were designed to explore facets of existence, things like racism, things like sexuality, things like mental health issues. There is a whole host of storylines that sometimes were dark. My dog is barking at somebody. Give it a second. It's probably the neighbor. Anyway, the independent comic scene was a space for comic artists and cartoonists to explore non-superhero themes. They could explore their sexuality, they could explore trauma, they could explore just about anything that was in their heads. But what was also really important was they were really often more often than not, trying to play with the form of comics. Again, as I've addressed in several videos before, and particularly the Understanding Comics issue, when we consider comics, it's traditionally the format of at least 2 to 4 panels of images arranged in a specific sequence to tell some kind of story. And especially when we consider superhero comics, these stories were often of caped crusaders, of like super rich eccentric billionaires, or just wacky weird people going off on crazy adventures and talking about punching somebody while they were throwing a punch, what have you. The medium as it existed had largely been driven by commercial factors. Again, there's nothing wrong with this, but the problem is when things are driven commercially, there's not a lot of emphasis played on introspection, and more importantly, there's not a lot of room for experimentation. granted, you will have comics that will play with the size of panels, but they're not going to play around with, hey, is this the first panel or is this the first panel? Do you go down like this and then read that way? Or are you supposed to go down like this and then read that way? Also, what if I want to talk about, say, my mother's suicide or my father being in the Holocaust? Or maybe I just want to tell a weird story about a detective who's chasing down a woman who was in a Picasso painting. Nobody in DC or Marvel would publish a book like that. And in fact, Spiegelman points it out. One of the really interesting things about Breakdowns is, while it is also largely a collection, he provides, in the opening panels, basically a short memoir autobiography through comics, explaining what was going on in his life as he was making each one of the comics contained in this collection. It's a really interesting read. It's some of Spiegelman's most recent work. As of late, he's predominantly sort of restricted himself to like sort of publishing work in the New Yorker, or occasionally putting out a new collection. Mouse basically kind of just, he's established himself, he has Mouse, and it's kind of hard to get out of that shadow now. But whatever the case, Breakdowns as a book was his opportunity as a young artist to kind of find his creative voice and then play with the medium. So hopefully now, at now close to 5 minutes, I've explained that Breakdowns really isn't a coherent narrative, because some of the collections in the story don't really have a plot. One story, Prisoner from Hell Planet, is about the suicide of Art Spiegelman's mother. Now, fun fact, this comic actually makes an appearance in the graphic novel Mouse. It was later, actually, he slips it into the book because at some point his father finds an old copy of it. There's also, in Breakdowns, an early draft of Mouse, where we see Art sort of applying his more sort of photorealistic style to the work. There is several little small, random, what the flip gags, and then a lot of times, again, most of the books in this collection are small experimental works designed to test the reader as they try to sort of work their way through the comic and see, okay, what is the story? And so I guess I would argue is that if you're somebody who approaches media, comics, or just any book with a concern for, I want a story, Breakdowns is not the book for you. This book is predominantly about either somebody who's interested in the life and work of Art Spiegelman, the artist, or somebody who's interested in comics, which are more about exploring the form rather than simply telling a deliberate story. I wouldn't say that there is no story in Breakdown or that there aren't any stories in Breakdowns, but if you're reading this book, you're reading it because you want to sort of see how you can play with the medium of comics and how ultimately Art Spiegelman was able to sort of find himself comfortably established in his aesthetic. So, again, if you're approaching this book for a narrative, you're not going to find it. I'm sorry, but you're just not going to. And even Art Spiegelman himself points out that in the 1970s, there wasn't a big market for a bunch of random what-the-flip comics. Some people would argue there isn't one today. I'd say bullshit. Comics like this are fun and interesting to nerds like me. So, now we kind of have an idea of what Breakdowns is about. Let's hop in now into just a couple of panels or pages to sort of see what he's doing in this collection. All right. Small side note about Art Spiegelman. Now that he's an established author, cartoonist, he can make his books as damn well big as he wants them. And in fact, the bitch of having Art Spiegelman books is trying to find some place to place his books on the bookshelf. Anyway, tangent done. Let's get back to Breakdowns. So, again, as I noted at the very beginning, what's really interesting about Breakdowns is the way he introduces his comic using a comic. Again, this isn't necessarily a novel trick, and I literally just finished the 9-video chapter-by-chapter sequence of Understanding Comics, which was a comic about comics. And so this isn't necessarily a novel approach, but Art Spiegelman's particular brand of humor, his sort of continual self-effacement, his sort of nod to his Jewishness and how it sort of conformed and constructed his identity, are all really at play in this opening sequence. And it's also interesting opportunities to see, one, the representation of himself and get an idea of how these comics ultimately came about. Because whether it's his early attempts at comics when he was a young man, or whether or not you get these small clips here where you can sort of see the foundation of what would eventually become his work in Mouse, we can see an artist who's trying to understand the sort of length and breadth of his career. And of course, what's interesting, I would argue as well, is the last page, because he sort of effectively repeats a lot of the imagery, he reuses a lot of the imagery, and the final page becomes a kind of meta commentary on his approach to comics as well as comics themselves. He really gets into, I believe the word is semiotics, he gets into the idea of kind of like linguistic structures. How exactly do comics function as a language? How do they function as a way of sort of transcribing and maintaining memory? How do they survive as a means of expressing the troublesome nature of the soul? There's just so much just in the introduction to this reprint. And I actually should have mentioned that in my sequences a second ago, please forgive me. But this is actually a reprint. The original comic breakdowns looked like this. It was originally just kind of like a loose leaf, basically just an oversized loose leaf comic book that contained a lot of these early sketches. The book is actually reprinted out by Pantheon, who's, as far as I'm aware of, the primary publisher of Art Spiegelman's works. And so, again, because he is the author of Mouse, and because he's written stuff like In the Shadows of No Towers, and he's pretty well established now in the culture, Pantheon came to him and went, hey, we could republish the book, and Art was like, okay, I don't know if you're going to sell anything, but why not? So, recognize when you're reading this book, Breakdowns is essentially a republishing of the original book with a little bit of added commentary to it. Now, the first work in the collection is actually, well, he provides, there was an original introduction to Breakdowns, but if you turn the page, you might recognize a rather familiar title. That's right. Mouse actually sort of existed years before the graphic novel that we all know and love actually came about. And what's interesting about this version here is, looking at just these three panels here, you can get a sense of what would eventually come later. The story is Art Spiegelman's father, Vladek, talking about being in Auschwitz and being a Jew in the Third Reich. And if you have read Mouse, you recognize, in fact, let me just go ahead and open up the book real quick. If you've read Mouse, you recognize that, or you will remember, that he was extraordinarily iconic, meaning that he kept a lot of his figures very cartoonish and just sort of basic in their overall construction. This is a way to sort of allow the reader to imprint on the characters and, more importantly, to empathize with them. What's interesting about Mouse is the reader doesn't get that. We get that anthropomorphization that would eventually become the fodder for English 1301 essays the world over, but at the same time, if you look at it, there's a lot more detail. He goes into a lot of cross-hatching. He shows a lot of explicit construction of the face of the cat and the mice themselves. We get the image of Vladek as a father. These characters are very much cartoons, but they're also detailed enough that it's difficult to imprint on them as a reader. There's a kind of separation, because at that moment we recognize, I'm not a mouse. Probably one of the best ones is this panel right here. You can see just the line work there. Partly is designed to sort of create tension within the frame, but it's also designed to act as fur for the mouse. It's hard for me to imprint upon a mouse. Nevertheless, it exists. And so what's really interesting then about this early draft is you see Spiegelman in his mind coming up with the idea for what Mouse would eventually become, but he's still sort of figuring out and playing with the medium. And again, if you look at the page, there's a lot of interesting play going on with panel layouts, panel sizes, what have you. Not that much play, but still there's a lot more than what you would observe in, say, a superhero comic book. There's definitely a lot more cross-hatching. This isn't a book filled with sort of cosmic images or imagery, what have you. This is a book that is really sort of just aware of itself in the fact that it's a comic book. This one here, Skinless Perkins, is literally a small panel or a small comic strip about a skeleton doing a backflip and then walking off, leaving his shadow behind, who then eventually walks off. And that's it. What's important to note here is right here, this top screen is a direct tie-in to a lot of 1920s Max Fleischer animated movies, as well as a couple of Walt Disney movies as well. During the 1920s, there would be sort of introductory screens where you would have a famous character, like, say, Bimbo or Betty Boop or Coco the Clown, and you would have an opening like this. Art Spiegelman is very much aware of the fact that while he's making this, he's tying into the history of cartoons and the consciousness of cartoons as part of the American creative landscape. There again, it's a little creative choice, but it's an important one, because again, we recognize that he's not just making these cartoon characters up to simply tell a funny story. He's making them up to also can't talk today, if ever. He's using little details like that to plug into America's conscious memory and try to understand how have cartoons been used in the past, how have comics been used in the past, and can we use them now to express more troublesome ideas. A lot of those early cartoons were filled with walking, talking skeletons that would interact with the characters. This story seems rather wacky from afar, and in fact it often is. But at the same time, we have to recognize we're reading a comic book about a walking skeleton who's leaving behind some kind of shadow. It's a sort of a tie-in to the specter of death. And the last words are, da-da-da, that's all, folks. I think it's funny, but I'm a nerd. Anyway, let's get to the really cool stuff, which is Prisoner on Hell Planet. Now again, if you've read Mouse, you've read Prisoner on Hell Planet, because he actually includes this book in the text. But what's important to note, you'll see again, I've mentioned how big this book is. Prisoner on Hell Planet was published in this size. In the back of this book, there's a small afterword by Spiegelman himself when he points out that the problem with the translation of Prisoner into Hell Planet in Mouse, you'll see there's a significant size difference. Prisoner on Hell Planet gets scrunched up to fit into Mouse, whereas with this collection, you're able to see the attention to line work and detail. Prisoner in Hell Planet describes Art Spiegelman's mother, specifically her suicide when he was a young man coming out of a mental hospital, and just the long-lasting emotional impact of it. It's gorgeous to behold, even though it is terribly tragic, because he's able to convey the tragedy and the trauma of recognizing the death of his mother, as well as his emotional reaction to it, which at times borders on apathy, and then more importantly, guilt. One of the most triggering passages, or perhaps one of the most haunting passages, is at the very end, when he describes his mother coming into his bedroom one night, asking, "Do you still love me?" And he's like, yeah, Ma, whatever. And then she closes the door. And that was like one of the last times he ever saw her. Prisoner on Hell Planet is heavy. But what's most important is the way Spiegelman uses line work to clue in the dramatic tension, the way he situates figures within the panel. You can observe the transformation of the Doctor. Here we see a kind of quasi-photorealistic perspective, but then dramatically upon the announcement of his mother's suicide, he becomes far more angular, and then by the end, he becomes a kind of mocking, otherly demon, just cackling and laughing. And so we see Spiegelman trying to translate the pain, the emotional burden of his mother's suicide, just upon his psyche and consciousness. Now, I'm going to go over just a couple more to really dig into it. Now, this one here, I don't get around much anymore. It's the left-hand side right here. It's a really interesting comic book, and it's one that, it's a really interesting comic, and it's one that sometimes gets used a lot. And in fact, Art Spiegelman, Scott McCloud uses a clip from this in the graphic novel Understanding Comics, this panel specifically. What's interesting about I don't get around much anymore is that while the reader follows the story panel to panel, the contents or the word bubbles in each panel directs directly back to the previous panel. So right here you'll note, this one says,
It has a TV, but it says the refrigerator is empty. And then if we go here, the sound doesn't work on the TV, but I don't care. I own a record. And on the previous panel, there's a record. So what's basically happening is the images are kind of trailing after the narrative itself, leading the reader to go, wait, I'm looking at one thing, but I'm being told about something else. This is important because it heightens the character's emotional apathy and his disconnect from reality. It's a little thing, but it demonstrates again what's really interesting to me about breakdowns in the way Spiegelman is trying to really play with the traditional means of reading a comic. Now, there are independent comics that do stuff like this today, but that's because Spiegelman and guys like Spiegelman and ladies like Spiegelman too, and non-gender specific individuals like Spiegelman too, did stuff like this in the 60s and 70s, which then set a creative framework for what would later come down. Again, I don't get around much anymore is deceptively simple, but it really shows how he's trying to play with the medium of comics. Now, Little Signs of Passion, this collection here, or this little short comic here, is interesting. I'm not really going to go into it that much. All that's really important to talk about is the fact that it's an opportunity for Spiegelman to reflect and then also to play with color. Though honestly and truthfully, Day at the Circuits, this comic strip here, I think does a lot better job of playing with color and then more importantly, experimenting with the form. This comic book here, again, Day at the Circuits, is unique because you'll observe between each of these panels there are little yellow arrows, as well as characters and word balloons. Where do you start? You start here. But now's the next question. Where do you go? Because there's an arrow pointing this way, an arrow pointing this way, and then an arrow pointing this way. Technically, you can read it any direction you want. This, to nerds like me, is really cool because it's a reminder again that there is a traditional format for the layout of the comics page, which is, if you're, again, a Western reader, you read left to right, top to bottom. If you're manga, you read right to left, top to bottom. But what if you don't have to read in that order? What if you give your reader options to create your own story? And again, what's interesting about this particular collection is, you'll note again, there are arrows pointing back to the original first panel. No matter what direction you start, you're going to find yourself out back at the beginning. And the story is primarily about these two dudes who are drinking, trying to figure out what do they want to do. And then they wind up right back where they started from. It sounds pretentious, and it probably is. But it's also a really interesting creative choice because, again, it puts responsibility on the reader, you, beautiful, wonderful people, to decide what direction do I want to go? What kind of story do I want to create? And have I actually gone somewhere? Because in the traditional format of left to right, top to bottom, you get the story quickly, easily, no problem. This requires a little bit more from the reader because it encourages imagination and it places agency in your hands to figure out, okay, what is the story, if there is a story, trying to do? What is it trying to convey? There's not much more I really want to talk about here. For the most part, the rest of this collection is Art Spiegelman doing sort of just very experimental comics. The Miracle Suite, I'm not going to lie, this one just about broke me because, again, he uses images from a previous panel to then clue into a story that's been taking place 14 panels earlier or the panel just before. It's crazy, but really interesting. Arguably, though, the most important one, and one that I really wanted to talk about, and I know we're getting close to 15 minutes, so I'm going to hurry up, I promise. But this one is called Ace Hole Midget Detective. And I need to say something right now. Obviously, that title has not aged well. The current politically correct term for individuals suffering from dwarfism, what have you, is little people. Art Spiegelman came of age during the late 1950s, early 60s. He's a man of his generation. Naturally, he's going to employ language like this. And also, I didn't get a chance to get into it, but in an earlier comic book as well, you'll observe down here in this later passage depictions of African Americans that, again, harken to minstrel-esque and blackface performances. At the time I'm recording this video, it's only a couple weeks after George Floyd's death. There's still protests in the street. Facebook is a war zone, and there are lots of people trying to be right in conversations rather than just trying to have a conversation. And I always try to make this explicitly clear. I'm not defending these choices creatively. I'm not. I'm going to contextualize them and try to understand them and hopefully try to see how they are part of an attempt at an aesthetic statement. But that is all I'm going to do. I don't like that title. I don't. And I'm not saying don't read Art Spiegelman because of that title, but Art Spiegelman does need to recognize that that title didn't age particularly well. The only thing I will argue for it is he's attempting to use the language that was available to him at that time to make some sort of creative statement. The story in question is a sort of crime noir that borders on stream of consciousness and art theory. Because again, we have Ace Hole, this extraordinarily small man who follows a woman who, I kid you not, is supposed to be based off of a portrait by Picasso. And like a typical noir story, it's filled with thugs and gangsters and double crosses, and by the end of it, you're ultimately not sure that anything happened, and of course, Ace Hole winds up alone and depressed, and then there's a small ad. But what's really interesting to me, again, is if you really look at that, Spiegelman is trying to use sort of, I think you could be arguing, I don't want to argue that he's writing the coattails of Picasso, because Picasso was a jerk and he wouldn't have been able to afford coattails. Yes, hashtag bitterness towards Picasso, but that's its own video. But I really like this book for the way he approaches art from a kind of democratic perspective, or at least a level playing field. It's okay to take a piece from a Picasso and bring it into a noir story and make it a character and just use it flagrantly alongside a Mr. Potato Head. Like, again, the underground comic scene was very much about just experimenting with America's cultural consciousness, experimenting with images, with narrative form, with panel layouts. And Ace Hole is yet another example in this wonderful collection of showing how Art Spiegelman in these early comics was really just trying to play with comics. Again, the traditional format was the superhero comic book. Set up a plot, hero overcomes the bad guy, the end. Unless it's, like a three-parter or a tie-in to a big event, what have you. Breakdowns was an attempt, more or less, he did the thing, to break down the comics medium and see how it's operating. What can you do with it, and do you have to always just tell a straight story? Maybe you can try to challenge your reader a little bit. And so hopefully I've demonstrated to you that breakdowns, just in these few small examples, is a really interesting and visually spectacular book for the medium of comics overall. Okay, I've done all of my so what statements, or I've covered what this book is about, I've covered why I think you should care about it. What's the final so what? The final so what is that Art Spiegelman is amazing. He really is. He's a true artist, a true craftsman, and what's really important is his willingness to play. Again, there's nothing wrong with traditional narrative format. There are plenty of people who tell amazing, incredible, wonderful stories using a traditional narrative format. But at the same time, comics is a medium. It's a form of art, which means we need people who are willing to sort of tinker with what we know to be the medium of comics and try to come up with something new. And sometimes that will involve introspection, sometimes it will involve experimentation with the form, sometimes it will involve just pure random craziness. But out of that craziness may emerge something important. Because again, a medium can only continue to exist and be relevant as long as artists see potential in it. And if there's any lesson from the experience of reading breakdowns, it was a reminder to me as a consumer of comics, as a lover of comics, as a maker of comics, I'm not limited to just square panels telling a traditional narrative. I have creative options. And so Breakdown, more than anything else, is an opportunity to reflect on how a generation of young artists approach the medium of comics, not just as a means of telling superhero stories about epic adventures, what have you. It was also a chance to discuss things like, hey, I spent a couple months in a mental hospital, or hey, my mother committed suicide and I'm still pretty messed up about it, or hey, we grew up seeing a lot of really racist depictions of African Americans. Like, that's super messed up. Why did that exist? Independent comics can sometimes be a space of pretension, but when done right, it's a space, it's a genre, it's an approach to comics that hopefully is about conviction. I'm doing this because I love the medium and I want to try to do something different with it. All right, I'm going to end it right there. Thank you for watching. As always, you guys are great. Thank you for indulging me in this. I know this video is probably well over the half-hour length. Just if you're still with me, you're beautiful. Thank you as always. Please like, share, and subscribe, all that jazz. It helps me know that you're watching this. It helps me know that you're liking this, and it keeps me actually going forward. I almost didn't record this because I was like, nobody watches this. Yes, they do. They do. I've got 3 views, I think. That's something. Also, as always, in the comment section, if there's a book that you think is really interesting, or if you've read breakdowns and you want to talk about Art Spiegelman, please leave a comment. I would love to talk about comics, because if it's not readily apparent, I love talking about comics. If you're interested in finding a copy of breakdowns, it might be a little hard to find. Like I said, the original breakdowns came out like in the late 70s, and a lot of those issues have pretty much been snatched up by collectors. Your local comic book shop may have a copy of breakdowns. May have that. If they can't, try asking them if they can order it for you. If you can't get it there, again, check out your local public library. They might have it in their collection, or they can potentially order it for you through an interlibrary loan system. As always, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Go read some comics.